In the mid-1970s, as the Portuguese Empire collapsed and the Cold War's competition for influence in Africa intensified, the Soviet Union's intervention in Angola began to generate consequences that extended far beyond Angola's borders, transforming neighboring states into contested arenas where proxy warfare, insurgency, and counterinsurgency blurred the distinction between internal instability and international conflict. And nowhere was this spillover more consequential than in Zaire and the Republic of the Congo, where fragile political systems, porous frontiers, and competing alliances turned local unrest into a regional struggle without clear borders. The roots of this spillover lay in the strategic realignment that followed Angola's independence in 1975, when the popular movement for the liberation of Angola consolidated power in Luanda with substantial Soviet and Cuban military support, a development that alarmed pro-Western regimes across Central Africa and reconfigured the regional balance of power. For the Soviet Union, Angola represented not only a foothold on the Atlantic, but a platform from which influence could radiate into southern and Central Africa, supporting Allied movements and pressuring hostile governments without the deployment of Soviet troops in combat roles, a strategy that relied on advisors, weapons, and coordination with Cuban forces to project power indirectly. For neighboring Zaire, ruled by Mobutu Sese Seko, the emergence of a Soviet-backed government on its southwestern border was perceived as an existential threat, not because of immediate invasion, but because it energized long-suppressed insurgent networks composed of former Katangan gendarmes and exiles who had fled Zaire years earlier and now found sanctuary, training, and logistical support across the border. These fighters, organized into movements that operated from Angolan territory, exploited the weakness of Zaire's state institutions, the corruption of its military, and the alienation of peripheral regions to launch incursions that challenged Mobutu's authority and exposed the fragility of a regime long sustained by Western support rather than internal cohesion. The most dramatic manifestation of this spillover occurred in the late 1970s, when insurgent forces crossed into Zaire's mineral-rich Shaba province, triggering a crisis that rapidly escalated beyond a local rebellion into an international confrontation involving African, European, and superpower interests. Although the Soviet Union denied direct orchestration of these incursions, the presence of Soviet-supplied arms, the coordination with Angolan territory, controlled by a Soviet-aligned government, and the broader pattern of regional alignment made it clear that the conflict could not be understood in purely domestic terms. The response to the Shaba crises revealed the Cold War logic governing Central Africa, as Western-aligned states mobilized rapidly to prevent the collapse of Mobutu's regime, deploying foreign troops and logistical support to repel insurgents while framing the intervention as a defense against external subversion rather than an internal rebellion rooted in Zaire's own political failures. This framing obscured the deeper dynamics at work as the insurgency drew strength from historical grievances, ethnic marginalization, and economic exploitation that had long undermined Zaire's stability. Yet it also underscored how the Soviet presence in Angola had altered the strategic environment by providing space and opportunity for these forces to operate. The spillover was not confined to Zaire, as the Republic of the Congo, already aligned with socialist states, became an additional node in this regional network, offering transit routes, political support, and diplomatic cover that further complicated efforts to isolate the conflict or impose clear lines of responsibility. Within this environment, the Soviet Union pursued a strategy of plausible deniability, supporting allies and shaping outcomes without assuming overt responsibility. calculating that the diffusion of conflict across borders reduced the risk of direct confrontation with the West while steadily eroding the security of pro-Western regimes. Cuban forces, operating primarily in Angola, but influencing regional dynamics through their presence and coordination, played a central role in stabilizing the Angolan government and indirectly enabling the projection of power outward, even as Havana publicly framed its involvement as internationalist solidarity rather than regional intervention. The United States and its allies, constrained by the memory of Vietnam and wary of direct military engagement, relied on regional partners and rapid response interventions to contain the spillover, reinforcing regimes like Mobutu's despite mounting evidence that such support perpetuated corruption and repression, a trade-off justified by the perceived necessity of blocking Soviet influence in a strategically sensitive region. This pattern of intervention without resolution turned Central Africa into a zone of chronic instability where conflicts overlapped, alliances shifted, and local actors leveraged superpower rivalry to pursue their own agendas, often exacerbating violence and undermining state authority. For populations living along these borders, the consequences were immediate and severe, as incursions, reprisals, and militarization disrupted livelihoods, displaced communities, and entrenched cycles of insecurity that transcended national boundaries. The absence of clear borders in this proxy war was not accidental but structural, reflecting a Cold War environment in which influence flowed through movements rather than states, and where sovereignty was compromised by the strategic calculations of distant powers. As the late 1970s progressed, it became increasingly apparent that the Soviet intervention in Angola had initiated a regional chain reaction, drawing Zaire and the Congo into a conflict they could neither fully control nor escape, and demonstrating how proxy warfare in Africa rarely remained confined to the territory where it began. This spillover revealed the limitations of containment strategies that focused on defending regimes rather than addressing underlying instability, and it exposed the degree to which Cold War competition in Africa operated through indirect pressure, insurgency, and deniable support rather than formal declarations of war. In this sense, the intervention in Angola's neighbors was less a series of discrete events than a continuous process of destabilization and counteraction, one that transformed Central Africa into a contested space where borders lost their meaning, and where the Cold War's global rivalry was experienced as a fragmented, persistent struggle embedded in local conflicts and unresolved grievances. As the spillover from Angola intensified, the Shaba crises in Zaire became the clearest expression of how proxy warfare dissolved borders and fused local insurgency with global rivalry, beginning in 1977, when forces known collectively as the Front for the National Liberation of the Congo advanced from bases in eastern Angola into Zaire's southeastern province, exploiting the depth and permissiveness of Angolan territory, now secured by a Soviet-aligned government and defended by Cuban troops, and transforming what Mobutu's regime portrayed as a sudden foreign invasion into a complex confrontation rooted in the unfinished business of decolonization and the militarized geography of the Cold War. The insurgents themselves were not a newly created proxy, but a reconstituted network of Katangan exiles, whose origins dated back to the early 1960s, when the collapse of the Katanga secession forced thousands of fighters into exile, embedding grievances that persisted through years of marginalization and periodic reorganization, and the Angolan civil war provided them with both sanctuary and opportunity, allowing their cause to be reframed within the ideological language of anti-imperialism, even as their immediate objective remained the overthrow of Mobutu's authority in a region rich in copper and cobalt. The 1977 incursion revealed the degree to which Zaire's state capacity had eroded as poorly trained and underpaid units collapsed or deserted, communications failed, and provincial authorities proved incapable of coordinating a coherent defense, exposing vulnerabilities that had been masked by years of Western financial and diplomatic support. The rapid advance of the insurgents forced an international response that underscored the Cold War logic of the region, as external actors moved swiftly to prevent a collapse that would have been interpreted as a strategic victory for the Soviet bloc, deploying foreign troops and airlifted equipment to stabilize the situation while avoiding direct attribution of the crisis to superpower orchestration. This intervention restored Mobutu's control in the short term, but failed to address the structural conditions that had enabled the incursion, ensuring that the conflict would recur rather than be resolved. The second Shaba crisis in 1978 confirmed this pattern as insurgents again crossed from Angolan territory, this time precipitating an even more dramatic international response that included rapid deployments by Western-aligned forces to secure key infrastructure and evacuate foreign nationals, illustrating how quickly localized violence could escalate into a multinational operation when strategic minerals, alliance credibility, and superpower signaling were at stake. Throughout these crises, the Soviet Union maintained formal distance, emphasizing Angolan sovereignty and denying direct involvement. Yet the strategic environment it had helped create through sustained support for the Angolan government made the spillover possible, demonstrating how influence could be exercised through permissive conditions rather than direct command. Cuba's role, while concentrated within Angola, was decisive in enabling this permissiveness, as its forces ensured that Luanda's control over territory adjacent to Zaire remained intact, indirectly facilitating the use of that territory by insurgent groups without Havana assuming responsibility for their actions beyond Angolan borders. The Republic of the Congo further complicated the picture by providing political alignment and logistical depth to the regional network of socialist-oriented states, reinforcing the sense that Central Africa had become a contiguous zone of contestation, where ideological alignment translated into strategic interdependence. For Western policymakers, the crises reinforced a perception that Soviet advances in Africa were not isolated events, but components of a broader strategy to exploit weak states and extend influence through deniable means, a perception that justified continued backing of authoritarian regimes despite mounting evidence that such support entrenched the very fragility that insurgents exploited. This dilemma reflected a core contradiction of Cold War policy in Africa, as efforts to contain external influence often deepened internal decay, creating cycles of instability that required repeated intervention. For populations in Shaba and along the Angolan frontier, these dynamics translated into chronic insecurity, displacement, and the normalization of militarization as towns changed hands. Reprisals followed incursions, and livelihoods were disrupted by a conflict that respected neither administrative boundaries nor civilian status. The porousness of borders was not merely geographic, but political, as authority fractured and allegiance became contingent, allowing armed groups to maneuver across jurisdictions and compelling states to rely on external patrons for survival. The spillover also altered military doctrine and expectations across the region, reinforcing the primacy of rapid reaction forces, air mobility, and external intervention as substitutes for sustainable governance, and embedding a model of crisis management that prioritized containment over resolution. By the end of the 1970s, it was evident that the Soviet intervention in Angola had catalyzed a regional system of proxy warfare in which Zaire and the Congo were no longer peripheral, but integral theaters, bound to Angola by insurgent networks, logistical corridors, and the strategic calculations of distant powers. This system functioned through ambiguity, enabling all major actors to deny responsibility while accepting outcomes that served their interests, and it persisted because no single state possessed the capacity or incentive to dismantle it unilaterally. The Shaba crises thus stand as pivotal episodes within a broader continuum of spillover, illustrating how proxy war without clear borders could destabilize entire regions, entangle multiple states, and convert historical grievances into instruments of Cold War competition, setting conditions that would endure well beyond the immediate confrontations and leaving Central Africa locked into a pattern of insecurity, shaped as much by external rivalry as by internal fracture. As the immediate crises subsided, the longer-term effects of the Angolan spillover became embedded in the political and security architecture of Central Africa, revealing how proxy war without fixed front lines reshaped states not through decisive victories, but through attrition, dependency, and the erosion of sovereignty, as Zaire and the Republic of the Congo adapted to a permanent condition of strategic exposure that neither domestic reform nor external intervention fully addressed. In Zaire, the restoration of control over Shaba following foreign-backed interventions reinforced Mobutu Sese Seko's reliance on external guarantors rather than internal legitimacy, deepening a cycle in which military weakness and political decay were compensated for through international rescue rather than structural change, a pattern that left the state increasingly hollow even as it survived repeated shocks. This survival came at a cost, as the presence of foreign forces and advisors underscored Zaire's vulnerability and fueled resentment among populations who experienced the conflict as a series of incursions, reprisals, and economic disruption without any corresponding improvement in governance or security. The militarization of Shaba and adjacent regions entrenched local power brokers, smuggling networks, and armed intermediaries who thrived in an environment where authority was fragmented and borders were porous, further undermining central control and creating conditions in which future instability was not an aberration, but an expectation. Across the border in Angola, the consolidation of the government's position with Soviet and Cuban support did not insulate the country from the consequences of regional entanglement, as maintaining control over vast territories adjacent to hostile or unstable neighbors required sustained military commitment and reinforced Luanda's dependence on external patrons, tying Angola's internal conflict to a wider regional contest that blurred the distinction between civil war and interstate rivalry. Cuban forces, while primarily focused on defending the Angolan state against internal opponents and external incursions, indirectly shaped the regional balance by ensuring that Angolan territory remained a secure rear area for Allied movements, a role that amplified Havana's influence far beyond Angola's borders, while binding it to the dynamics of Central African instability. The Republic of the Congo, aligned with socialist states yet constrained by limited capacity, functioned as a logistical and political intermediary, illustrating how smaller states could become nodes in a proxy network without exercising decisive control over outcomes, and highlighting the asymmetry of influence within the Soviet-aligned camp itself. For the Soviet Union, the spillover validated a strategy that prioritized influence through Allied governments and movements rather than direct intervention, allowing Moscow to expand its presence while avoiding overt confrontation. Yet, it also exposed the limits of such an approach, as the instability generated by proxy warfare proved difficult to manage and risked entangling the Soviet bloc in conflicts driven by local grievances beyond external control. The persistence of low-level conflict along Angola's borders revealed how the Cold War in Africa operated through diffusion rather than containment as violence migrated across frontiers, alliances shifted, and local actors adapted global rivalries to serve their own purposes, often exacerbating fragmentation rather than producing stable alignments. Western responses mirrored these dynamics, as repeated interventions to stabilize allies like Zaire prioritized short-term security over long-term reform, reinforcing authoritarian governance and perpetuating the conditions that insurgents exploited, a trade-off justified by the perceived necessity of blocking Soviet influence, but one that entrenched chronic instability. The human cost of this spillover was substantial, as civilian populations bore the brunt of displacement, militarization, and economic disruption, living in regions where state authority was intermittent and where allegiance could invite retaliation from multiple sides, a reality that underscored the disconnect between strategic calculations and lived experience in proxy wars without clear borders. Analytically, the Angolan spillover illustrates how Cold War competition in Africa was less about decisive conquest than about shaping environments, creating zones of influence and insecurity that constrained opponents while rarely delivering durable control, and how such environments tended to persist because they benefited external patrons by keeping rivals off balance. By the early 1980s, Central Africa had become emblematic of this pattern, a region where the Soviet intervention in Angola had triggered a chain reaction that neither side could fully reverse, embedding instability into the regional order and transforming Zaire and the Congo into permanent frontiers of Cold War rivalry. This transformation altered how conflict was understood and managed, shifting emphasis from borders and treaties to mobility, deniability, and the manipulation of local actors, and reinforcing the sense that sovereignty in this context was conditional and contested rather than absolute. The endurance of these dynamics demonstrated that proxy wars did not require clear victories to be strategically effective, as the mere persistence of instability could serve to weaken adversaries and justify continued involvement, even as it undermined the prospects for peace and development. In this sense, the Soviet intervention in Angola's neighbors functioned as a catalyst for a regional system of insecurity, one that blurred lines between domestic and international conflict and revealed how Cold War rivalry in Africa produced not stable spheres of influence, but overlapping zones of contestation where borders lost meaning and violence became normalized. As this system matured, it became increasingly self-sustaining, driven by the interests of local elites, external patrons, and armed groups alike, ensuring that the spillover from Angola would remain a defining feature of Central African geopolitics long after the initial interventions, and illustrating how proxy war without clear borders reshaped the Cold War landscape through diffusion, dependency, and the erosion of state authority rather than through decisive military outcomes. As the proxy system generated by Angola's spillover matured through the early 1980s, its most defining characteristic was not escalation toward open, interstate war, but the normalization of instability as a strategic condition in which violence, intervention, and deniability became routine instruments of governance and survival for states caught along the fault lines of Cold War rivalry. And this normalization altered the behavior of regional actors as profoundly as it shaped superpower calculations. In Zaire, repeated rescue operations reinforced the understanding that regime survival depended less on internal reform than on the timely mobilization of external support, a logic that encouraged political stagnation and deepened corruption, as resources were diverted toward patronage and security rather than institutional development, leaving the state increasingly incapable of controlling its own territory without foreign assistance. This dependency weakened sovereignty in practice, even as it preserved it in form, creating a paradox in which Zaire remained intact on the map, while authority on the ground fractured into zones of control mediated by local elites, armed groups, and external patrons. The spillover from Angola thus did not simply threaten Zaire through direct incursion, but hollowed it from within, as the constant expectation of crisis undermined incentives for long-term planning and entrenched a politics of emergency that rewarded loyalty and coercion over competence and accountability. Similar dynamics emerged in the Republic of the Congo, where alignment with socialist states provided security guarantees and material support, but also bound domestic politics to regional instability, limiting autonomy and exposing the state to pressures generated by conflicts beyond its borders. In both cases, the proximity to Angola transformed borders into corridors rather than barriers, facilitating the movement of fighters, weapons, and influence in ways that eroded the distinction between internal security and external defense. For the Angolan government, maintaining control over these corridors required sustained military effort and external backing, reinforcing a dependence on Soviet and Cuban support that tied Angola's internal war to the fate of its neighbors and ensured that any shift in regional balance would reverberate across multiple fronts. Cuban forces, while often portrayed as a stabilizing presence, became embedded in this system as guarantors of a strategic rear area, enabling Luanda to project influence outward, even as it struggled to consolidate authority at home, a dual role that exemplified the blurred lines between defense and intervention, characteristic of proxy war. The Soviet Union's position within this system was deliberately indirect, relying on allies to shape outcomes while maintaining formal distance, a strategy that minimized the risk of direct confrontation, but also limited Moscow's ability to control the consequences of its support, as local actors pursued agendas that sometimes diverged from broader strategic objectives. This limitation became increasingly evident as conflicts persisted without resolution, consuming resources and attention while yielding diminishing returns in terms of stable influence. Western responses mirrored this indirectness, as repeated interventions to stabilize allies like Zaire prioritized immediate containment over structural reform, reinforcing authoritarian governance and perpetuating the conditions that insurgents exploited, a cycle that locked external powers into reactive postures rather than proactive solutions. The result was a regional equilibrium defined by chronic insecurity, where no actor sought decisive victory because victory itself was ill-defined, and where the continuation of instability served as both justification and mechanism for ongoing involvement. For civilian populations, this equilibrium translated into a lived experience of uncertainty, displacement, and militarization, as communities along borders navigated shifting allegiances and the constant risk of violence, often with little recourse to effective protection or representation. The social fabric of these regions frayed under the weight of repeated incursions and reprisals, embedding trauma and mistrust that outlasted the immediate Cold War context and complicated post-conflict recovery. Analytically, the Angolan spillover demonstrates how proxy wars functioned less as discrete conflicts than as systems of interaction, sustained by feedback loops in which instability generated interventions that in turn produced further instability, creating self-reinforcing dynamics resistant to resolution. These dynamics were particularly pronounced in Africa, where colonial borders, weak institutions, and economic dependency provided fertile ground for the diffusion of conflict, and where superpower rivalry exploited existing fractures rather than creating entirely new ones. By the mid-1980s, Central Africa had become emblematic of this pattern, a region where Cold War competition was experienced not as ideological confrontation, but as an ongoing condition of insecurity shaped by overlapping alliances and unresolved grievances. The absence of clear borders in this proxy war was thus both cause and consequence of the conflict, as porous frontiers enabled insurgency and intervention while the persistence of violence further undermined border control, creating a vicious cycle that eroded the very concept of territorial sovereignty. This erosion had strategic implications beyond the region, as it demonstrated the limits of influence gained through proxy warfare and raised questions about the sustainability of strategies that prioritize denial and containment over stability and governance. For the Soviet Union, the Angolan spillover delivered influence, but at the cost of entanglement in a regional system it could shape but not fully control, highlighting the risks inherent in relying on allied movements and states to project power. For Western powers, the experience underscored the moral and strategic costs of supporting fragile regimes as bulwarks against external influence, revealing how such support could entrench instability and undermine long-term interests. As the Cold War entered its later stages, these lessons remained unresolved, embedded in policies that continued to favor short-term security over structural change. The proxy war without clear borders thus persisted as a defining feature of Central African geopolitics, not because it delivered decisive outcomes, but because it aligned with the incentives of both local and external actors who benefited from its continuation. In this sense, the Soviet intervention in Angola's neighbors illustrates a broader truth about Cold War conflict in the global South. That influence was often exercised through the management of instability rather than its resolution, and that the most enduring legacy of such intervention was not territorial gain, but the normalization of violence and dependency as instruments of political order. As the decade progressed, the region remained locked into this pattern, its borders increasingly irrelevant to the movement of conflict, and its states constrained by a strategic environment in which peace was provisional and insecurity institutionalized, a condition born of spillover and sustained by the logic of proxy war itself. As the Cold War edged toward its denouement in the late 1980s, the proxy system generated by the Soviet intervention in Angola and its spillover into neighboring states did not collapse so much as it gradually lost strategic centrality, revealing how wars without borders could persist long after their original rationale had faded, sustained by local incentives, institutional decay, and the inertia of militarized politics rather than by coherent external design. In Central Africa, the networks of insurgency, counterinsurgency, and external intervention that had taken shape in the 1970s continued to shape outcomes even as superpower priorities shifted, demonstrating that proxy warfare often outlived the geopolitical calculations that had initiated it. In Zaire, the cumulative effects of repeated crises left a state that appeared stable only through constant external reinforcement, its security forces fragmented, its economy distorted by patronage and extraction, and its legitimacy eroded by decades of governance oriented toward survival rather than development. Conditions that ensured that even as the intensity of Cold War rivalry declined, the underlying drivers of instability remained intact. The spillover from Angola had thus contributed to a structural weakening that could not be reversed simply by changes in global alignment, as the habits of militarization, reliance on foreign rescue, and tolerance of corruption had become embedded in the political system. In Angola itself, the continuation of internal conflict meant that the country remained a source of regional instability, even as external support evolved, with the presence of foreign forces and advisors sustaining a strategic environment in which borders functioned as zones of interaction rather than lines of separation. The Republic of the Congo, similarly, remained entangled in this environment, its alignment and security shaped less by autonomous choice than by the gravitational pull of regional dynamics set in motion by earlier interventions. As superpower competition receded, the indirect influence exercised through these networks diminished, yet the structures they had produced proved resilient, continuing to generate violence and insecurity independent of external direction. This persistence highlighted a fundamental asymmetry in proxy warfare, whereby external actors could initiate or intensify conflict relatively easily, but found disengagement far more difficult as local actors adapted to the incentives of militarization and developed interests in the continuation of instability. The Soviet Union's own trajectory underscored this. Dynamic, as internal transformation and eventual collapse curtailed its capacity and willingness to sustain extensive overseas commitments, leaving allied states and movements to navigate a strategic environment suddenly stripped of its primary external patron. In Central Africa, this withdrawal of attention did not translate into immediate stabilization, as the absence of clear borders and the legacy of proxy networks meant that conflict dynamics were now self-sustaining, driven by competition over resources, power, and survival rather than ideological alignment. Western powers, too, recalibrated their engagement, reducing direct intervention while continuing to support favored regimes, a shift that reflected both changing strategic priorities and fatigue with repeated crises that delivered diminishing returns. Yet this recalibration did little to alter the underlying conditions that proxy warfare had entrenched, as fragile states remained vulnerable to internal challenge and external pressure alike. For civilian populations, the end of the Cold War offered limited relief, as the violence and insecurity generated by years of spillover persisted in the absence of effective governance or economic recovery, revealing the long shadow cast by conflicts that had been shaped by distant rivalries but lived locally. Analytically, the Angolan spillover demonstrates how the Cold War in Africa produced outcomes that were decoupled from the eventual resolution of East-West confrontation, leaving behind regions where the end of superpower rivalry did not equate to peace, but rather exposed the depth of damage inflicted by decades of indirect intervention. The absence of clear borders in these proxy wars meant that responsibility was diffuse and accountability elusive, complicating efforts at post-conflict reconstruction and reconciliation, as no single actor could be identified as the architect of the instability that had become normalized. This diffusion also undermined the capacity of states to reassert sovereignty, as borders that had functioned as conduits for conflict could not easily be transformed back into instruments of control without resources and legitimacy that were in short supply. The legacy of the Soviet intervention in Angola's neighbors thus lies not in specific battles or diplomatic maneuvers, but in the structural transformation of a region where sovereignty was weakened, militarization entrenched, and conflict rendered portable across frontiers. This transformation illustrates a broader pattern of Cold War proxy warfare, in which the strategic objectives of external powers were often achieved in the short term through deniable support and allied intervention, but at the cost of long-term instability that persisted long after the original rivalry had receded. In Central Africa, the resulting landscape was one in which borders mattered less than networks, where authority was fragmented and contested, and where peace was not the default condition, but a temporary respite in an ongoing struggle shaped by the residue of external intervention. As historians assess the Cold War's impact on Africa, the spillover from Angola into Zaire and the Congo stands as a stark example of how proxy war without clear borders could hollow out states, entangle regions, and produce enduring insecurity, even in the absence of decisive victories or formal annexations. The conflict's legacy is thus measured not by territorial change, but by the persistence of fragility, the normalization of intervention, and the erosion of the very boundaries that define statehood. In this sense, the Soviet intervention in Angola's neighbors encapsulates the paradox of Cold War competition in the global South, where influence was expanded through indirect means, but stability proved elusive, and where the end of ideological rivalry did not undo the damage inflicted by years of conflict conducted in the shadows. As the Cold War closed, Central Africa remained shaped by these dynamics, its borders scarred by a history of spillover that blurred the line between domestic and international conflict, and left behind a region struggling to reclaim sovereignty in a landscape fundamentally altered by proxy war without clear borders. In its final historical balance, the Soviet intervention in Angola's neighbors stands as one of the most revealing examples of how Cold War power was exercised through diffusion rather than conquest, producing a regional condition in which conflict escaped territorial containment and sovereignty was steadily eroded by the logic of proxy competition. And the significance of this spillover lies not in any single incursion or intervention, but in the way it transformed Central Africa into a system of insecurity that outlived the strategic priorities that had given it shape. The wars that crossed from Angola into Zaire and the Republic of the Congo demonstrated that once borders became permeable to armed movements and external support, they ceased to function as stabilizing boundaries and instead became vectors through which violence, influence, and instability circulated, undermining the capacity of states to govern and compelling them to rely on external patrons for survival. For Zaire, repeated crises confirmed that regime preservation could be achieved without reform, reinforcing a political economy of dependency in which corruption, repression, and foreign rescue replaced legitimacy and institutional strength, leaving behind a hollowed state that appeared intact only through continual intervention. For Angola, the consolidation of power with Soviet and Cuban backing secured the regime but bound it to a regional struggle that extended the costs of its internal war outward, ensuring that its borders remained militarized interfaces rather than lines of separation. The Republic of the Congo's role as an aligned intermediary illustrated how smaller states were drawn into proxy, systems not as decisive actors, but as nodes within networks shaped by larger strategic forces, their autonomy constrained by the gravitational pull of regional instability. For the Soviet Union, the spillover validated a method of influence that minimized direct confrontation and maximized deniability. Yet it also revealed the limits of such an approach, as instability proved easier to generate than to control, and the consequences of proxy warfare accumulated beyond Moscow's capacity to manage them. Western powers, in responding to these dynamics, mirrored the same pattern, privileging containment and regime survival over structural reform, and thereby perpetuating the fragility that made spillover possible in the first place. The result was a regional equilibrium defined not by peace or resolution, but by managed disorder in which no actor sought decisive victory and all adapted to the persistence of low-level conflict as a normal condition. The human cost of this equilibrium was borne by populations living along blurred borders, for whom the Cold War was experienced not as ideology, but as repeated displacement, militarization, and insecurity imposed by forces that rarely offered protection or accountability. Analytically, the Angolan spillover reveals how Cold War rivalry in Africa functioned through the creation of environments rather than outcomes, shaping incentives and constraints in ways that locked states into cycles of dependence and instability without delivering durable control or legitimacy. The absence of clear borders in this proxy war was both symptom and strategy, enabling all parties to deny responsibility while benefiting from the pressure exerted on adversaries and ensuring that accountability for violence remained diffuse and elusive. As the Cold War ended and superpower rivalry receded, the structures produced by this spillover did not dissolve, underscoring a central paradox of proxy warfare, that its legacies persist independently of the geopolitical conflicts that initiated them. Central Africa emerged from this period not as a stabilized sphere of influence, but as a region marked by weakened states, entrenched militarization, and borders whose authority had been fundamentally compromised by years of cross-border conflict. The Soviet intervention in Angola's neighbors thus occupies a critical place in Cold War history, illustrating how power exercised indirectly can transform entire regions without ever producing formal annexation or decisive victory, and how the most enduring consequences of global rivalry are often found not in the capitals of great powers, but in the peripheral zones where proxy war dissolves the very framework of statehood. In this sense, the conflict stands as a cautionary case, demonstrating that wars without clear borders do not end cleanly, and that the strategic gains achieved through deniable intervention come at the cost of long-term instability that persists long after the original contest has faded, leaving behind a landscape shaped less by ideology than by the residue of conflict diffused across frontiers and embedded in the political and social fabric of entire regions.